Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panels on energy and Russia weaponizing energy as a geopolitical tool. We are really thankful that you're joining us. We appreciate your time, but in hope that you will find the panels extremely interesting, particularly given the slate of wonderful guests with a huge wealth of experience and knowledge with respect to energy, Russian and European affairs in the region and as a whole. Today's panels are part of Energy Week at Penn, a full week of energy-focused events across campus. So please make sure you check out at the Kleinman Center website, UPenn Week, for other events if you'd like to join either online or in person. And so without more ado, I'd like to introduce our guest who will talk in this first panel. We'll talk about how Russia is working within the bounds of sanctions and of limitations that have been imposed on it given its aggression on Ukraine, and how potentially Moscow could move forward. We have 4 guests. One will be joining us shortly, but I still introduce them, and we will go in the order I will introduce them right now. First, we'll have Ambassador John Herbst, who is a Senior Director of the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. He was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006, and I encourage everybody to look up all the panelists' bios because they're extremely long and very very impressive. But in the interest of time, I will be very short here introducing them. Vladimir Milov is our second panelist. He's a Russian opposition politician and Vice President for International Advocacy, Free Russia Foundation. He's a former Deputy Minister of Energy of Russia, advisor to Minister of Energy, and Head of Strategy Department at the Federal Energy Commission, the natural monopoly regulator. Tatiana Mitrova is Research Fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and from February 2017 to December 20, she was the Executive Director of the Energy Center of the Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo. Last but not least, Alan Riley is a non-resident Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and Professor at City Law School. I will welcome now Ambassador John Herbst to give his remarks. Please, if you have questions, we're hoping for a longer discussion after remarks. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A section so we can moderate them and encourage discussion after the 5-minute remark of each of our panelists. Welcome, Ambassador Herbst.
Thank you. I am not an energy expert nor an economist, but I know something about geopolitics. And I'll talk about Russian energy in that context. Let me offer for you a thought that, in fact, you might say politics or geopolitics works against Russia and in favor of the West in this current circumstance as regards energy. As we all know, Europe developed a very deep dependency on Russian gas in particular, but also oil, that began in the 1980s with the pipelines that was initially opposed by then US President Ronald Reagan. And that dependency grew over time, incredibly, even after Moscow began its war in Ukraine in 2014. We all know that Nord Stream 2 is a project that was conceived and began to be executed after the Russian seizure of Crimea and its war in Donbass. And that was driven by economics, not politics, because, of course, Moscow is a great hydrocarbon power. Pipelines are the most efficient way to deliver gas. Russia is close to Europe. And so this relationship developed. But as a consequence of a series of events culminating in Moscow's big invasion of Ukraine last February, Europe decided, for political reasons, to end that or limit sharply that relationship with Russia. And, Europe was pulling in 50% of its imports and gas from Russia a year ago. By last fall, that had dropped to 18%. And on oil, a year ago, Russia was sending about 25% of Europe's imports of gas, of oil, and that was cut to 7%, I think, by last fall. So politics drove that change in the energy relationship. And politics also, sanctions led to serious export restrictions to Russia, which will make Russia's ability to replenish its oil and gas supplies much more difficult. And we know that Russian reserves today are lower than they were 30 years ago. So they need that technology to get the harder to find, harder to exploit oil and gas. Now, the interesting thing is that geopolitics have only a little bit helped Russia in dealing with the problems that its war in Ukraine has created for its energy exports to Europe. Now, let me explain that. We all know that the West began this price cap on oil, which many experts, economists were dubious of, but it seems to be working. That's not the key point here. The key point here is that Moscow does have geopolitical allies, most prominently China, whose leader is currently sitting in Moscow. And they are willing, those allies, those few allies that Russia has, or partners that Russia has, to help Russia by buying its hydrocarbons and other products. But the interesting thing is that they're only willing to do it at bargain basement prices. So the help they are providing Putin in his straitened circumstances is very much limited. That's why I said that geopolitics in this crisis works for the West, for Ukraine, and against Putin and the Russian regime. And that's a very good thing. Last point. We don't know what will be the Russian energy relationship with Europe after this war finally ends. My idea for your consideration is that will depend largely on the Russia that emerges at the end of this war. If it's a Russia seething with resentment at Ukraine's independence and Western support for Ukraine, I suspect Russia's will continue to be a tiny supplier of hydrocarbons to Europe. If it's a truly reformed Russia, of the type that Vlad has been working for his whole life, things could be very different and much better. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ambassador Herbst. We'll move now to Vladimir Milov for his remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm unmuted now. I hope you can hear and see me well. Thank you for having me at this important discussion, and many thanks to Ambassador Herbst for his remarks. I'll just follow up on that. I think to make the long story short, there is no coming back to the good or bad old days, whichever point you're looking at that from. Russia will never, or at least for some lengthy period of time, probably until Europe moves further towards its green energy transition, Russia will never come back to the European market with significant volumes of energy supplies. And I agree with Ambassador, a lot here depends on what kind of political regime we will have in Moscow. We see right now that Putin's regime, or whoever succeeds him, there's a predominant chance that they will continue this aggressive neo-imperialist policies, which means that there will be a very significant degree of political risk for any future energy relations, energy contracts. So what we will see is probably some sort of short-term purchases, like on the background of a near complete stop of Russian pipeline gas exports to Europe last year. There was a significant surge in purchases of Russian LNG by primarily Western European countries. So this short-term situative relations might go on, but any longer-term contracts, and Gazprom's relations with Europe were largely based on a long-term relationship and contracts with large maturity. They will be exposed to significant degree of political risk because you never know when Putin or any of his hardline successors will strike again. Who will they attack next? So when I talk to all these top managers of European energy companies in the previous years with the same level of criticism as mentioned by Ambassador regarding President Reagan administration, they all said to me like 10, 15 years ago, but what can possibly happen? Yes, you have some issues with human rights in Russia, but largely we're fine. And you're overestimating political risk. Now it looks like they have underestimated it. Instead, I think large players in Europe will not make the same mistake again. And there will be no comeback of Russia as a long-term, large volume supplier of both gas and oil, unless there will be guarantees that there will be a fundamental political shifts in Russia's standing, renouncing the imperialism, recognizing the damage done to Ukraine, paying wartime reparations, and surrendering war criminals for international tribunal. Until all that happens, the chapter will not be closed, connected with current war and associated political implications. So it means I just don't see, before that happens, I just don't see Russia coming back to the European market big time. It is a very interesting question what might happen if there will be a profound political change in Russia and might be a new opening for a responsible democratic government. We have been discussing this a lot with colleagues, and actually our main point is that we don't want to come back to the European market as a major supplier of oil and gas. We have been talking for decades about getting rid of dependence of Russian economy on hydrocarbon exports. And this is like a great opportunity for us to build a totally new economy and to jump rather into a green transition. International Energy Agency assesses that the market for goods and services for clean energy will reach $800 billion by 2030 and over $1 trillion by 2050 in a net zero emissions scenario. That's a big market. A forward-looking government, forward-oriented government will mostly think about how to enter this market and not to try to restore the old-style fossil fuel relations, which are and will be becoming history. And I will finish with saying that what we see right now in terms of Russia's attempts to mitigate all the situation, this big pivot to Asia, attempts to redirect energy flows to Asian markets, they just don't seem to be working too well. I completely agree with Ambassador that most of these supplies come with huge discounts. Asian consumers are extremely pragmatic and they are well aware of all kinds of difficulties that Russia finds themselves in. So I compare this, like when newborn baby turtles are born and rush to the sea, there's usually a whole set of predators waiting for them to feed upon. And this is the kind of metaphor that can be used to characterize Asian consumers who are, yes, waiting and well prepared for all these discounted Russian oil and gas. They clearly demand very steep discounts, as we saw it. The other thing is that supplies to Asia come with extreme additional costs, extreme costs. My estimate is that extra cost of exporting a barrel of oil from the Black or Baltic Sea to India is way over $10 per barrel. Because you have to do like over a month shipping. And this is why India never received significant amounts of Russian oil before the war. So all this new infrastructure to be built towards Asia would require hundreds of billions of dollars. So a lot of extra costs, discounted price, which means that Russia will never ever be able to derive comparable level of profits from the Asian markets as it did in Europe. So to sum up, I would say we might be observing as well as something like the end of Russian hydrocarbon economy as we knew it. And we see it in the current parameters of extreme Russian budget deficit, less money, more costs, which means that we also, in Russia, we also underestimated for years how attractive was Europe as a partner. It delivered great profits and significant income from all these oil and gas exports. It will be much more difficult now. There is absolutely no alternative to the lucrative European market, which we seemingly have lost something like forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. Let's move to Tatiana, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Good morning to everybody. And I would completely agree with Vladimir that it's not possible to see any large-scale comeback of Russian oil and gas supplies to Europe in any foreseeable future. First of all, due to the energy transition, which Europe is speeding up now, and to all the diversification efforts that Europe is undertaking right now. And I would say rather successfully. So this winter, the demand reduction, gas demand reduction by nearly 50 billion cubic meters. It looked like something completely impossible, but it came true. And at the same time, I would be really cautious with predicting a sort of collapse of the Russian economy and oil and gas sector, because it is still extremely resilient. So yes, the revenues are going down, we can see it, and even Russian official statistics is disclosing it. But they are still in the range of the previous 5 years, lower than the peak of 2022, when the extraordinary high prices provided for extraordinary revenues, but still rather high. And the industry itself, I'm talking about oil and gas, it is rather localized. So there are some spare parts, there is some critical equipment which is not produced in Russia, which it is difficult to obtain through different intermediary schemes and so on. But there are, it's not the bulk of oil and gas production. The major part of production and exports can be executed without reliance on the sanctioned technologies. Russia still has substantial financial reserves, which were accumulated during the previous periods of high prices. It still has manpower and qualified personnel. And, you know, this wording, Russia is never as weak as it looks and never as strong as it looks. I think it's absolutely applicable to the whole discussion about the energy sector. Yes, the efficiency will go down, the production and export volumes will go down, the revenues will go down, but it will be still sufficient to sustain the current economic machine for quite a long period of time. And therefore, discussion about the impact of sanctions, which we are going to have in the second panel, as far as I understand, and basically the discussion of the secondary sanctions, of the role of China, India, and the other non-OECD countries in purchasing Russian hydrocarbons and potentially investing into the Russian energy sector, which could come out also in the future. I mean, while we are talking now, there are these negotiations between Putin and Xi Jinping ongoing, and energy was announced like a core part of the whole discussion. No official announcements so far, but it could well be that China will step forward with equipment supplies and additional contracts for oil and gas offtake. So it is extremely complicated picture, and we made some analysis at Columbia with my colleagues on the future scenarios of the Russian gas exports. So there is a paper published on this topic. We see that, yes, Russian gas will not come back to Europe, even in the most optimistic scenario, to the levels of the pre-war, but all in all, Russia will be able to supply to the global market quite considerable volumes comparable to the historical levels, with lower revenues, with lower margins, but still remaining a very important player on the global gas battlefield. And as an oil supplier, it will still remain a considerable force. So it is a very important point for consideration. Even weaker Russia under the sanctions is still a very powerful player. That's my main message. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, for this viewpoint on the state of the Russian industry. It's extremely important to understand the internal workings, I believe, as much as the external ones. Let's move to Alan, who was able to join us. Thank you for joining, and please provide your remarks.
Thank you very much. Well, let me start by saying that I'm going to take a different view to everybody else. My view is that is it the end of Russian energy in Europe? I suspect not. And one of the reasons why I take this view is that I went to this conference in Berlin organized by DIGAP and the Atlantic Council, in fact, in January, and listening to all the German officials talk about all of their sort of approaches to dealing with alternative energy supplies and their problems with them, I came out of it thinking that in reality, the difficulties that Germany has created for itself are so great that ultimately they will just revert to mean and go back to using Russian gas. And the reason why I think that is, let me just take you through the kind of pattern of this. If you want a lot of liquid natural gas at reasonable prices, what you do is you organize yourself some long-term supply contracts with American or Qatari, whoever suppliers, because you get a lower price overall, you get dependable supplies. Germany won't do that because the argument is that we are moving to the energy transition and we can't take a 20-year contract. But if you don't take a 20-year contract, then you can't, there's no economic incentive for the LNG producers to invest in that additional production and delivery facilities. Of course, I find this a bit difficult to understand at one level, because whilst it is true that it is a 20-year contract, many of the German energy companies have got very long contracts, extant contracts with Gazprom anyhow. So if you're replacing the contracts, what is the problem? But anyhow, the energy transition is the excuse. The second is they won't use any nuclear, no more nuclear, and in fact, close what nuclear we have available already. Well, of course, that removes a significant capacity to deliver power, replace fossil fuels. Okay, we can have an argument about nuclear, but it's an existing energy facility which you should not at least want to reduce even further, because that creates even more demand for energy from elsewhere. And the third major German kind of renewable portfolio is in relation to wind. And the problem with wind, Germany has already put so much wind on the system, it's difficult to bring any more in. In addition to which, in order to bring any more in, you need to build the intermittency across the system to ensure that the intermittency is reduced. You have to have a lot of additional network capacity to bring the network, to bring the power to where it's needed. And then German NIMBYism and German planning restrictions make that really difficult. So if you can't really deliver LNG, if you can't really do nuclear and you can't really do wind, what are you going to do? And that then takes you back to the argument that the real solution is to go back to Russian gas. And in fact, technically, they can. You see, the issue, one can have an argument about how Nord Stream 1 and the first pipeline of Nord Stream 2 was blown up, and I'm not going to get into that. But just let me run it as a legal analysis. If you go back to what happens, from about March of 2021, way before the war, first of all, Gazprom reduces the amount of gas going into the European spot market. Then it starts later on as the war goes on to actually reduce the amount of long-term supply contract gas. At that point, they were in danger of being sued by the 154 companies who have long-term supply contracts with them in Europe for damages for non-supply. One of the ways you get around that is to blow the pipelines, and then you can claim force majeure. But those pipelines have only been blown to a small degree, and they can be restored by a, we'll be spending, according to the New York Times, around $500 million. This is cheap as chips, really. You can restore the pipelines, and then you can say to all your European customers, well, the pipelines have been restored, and here the gas can flow once again, and you have a legal obligation to take the gas. So my, call me paranoid, call me suspicious if you like, but my suspicion is that given the problems Germany has in delivering any alternatives, the line of least resistance and the line which gets a lot of cheap gas into German industry is restoring the Nord Stream pipelines and going back to business as usual. So then the question is, what do you do about that? And my own view about this is that we actually need a European policy to deal with this at European level. I think principally by having a single European purchaser for all Russian gas, imposing a maximum level Russian gas so it can't create energy dependence, imposing a low fixed price, probably linked to Henry Hub, a kind of Henry Hub price. And then in order to ensure there's no distortion on the European market, have that gas then auctioned onto the European market, so it's at market prices. And if the single European purchaser obviously will make money out of that, and that money goes to the reconstruction of Ukraine. And something like that is probably what we will have to do. But if we leave it as it is, essentially what we will see is that the German incentives to go back to business as usual, because of the essential weakness of German energy policy, will end up taking us back in the direction of more Russian gas. And we'll be back to something like business as usual. Now, we'll be wholly business as usual. I would agree that we won't go back to 150 billion cubic meters of gas being provided into Europe, but it could be something like, I don't know, 50, 60 billion cubic meters coming through Nord Stream, and another 20 to 30 billion cubic meters coming through Turk Stream. Well, you can see how that would work as a new, more minimal business model, which at least looks after Russian allies in Europe, Germany, Hungary, and Serbia. And that's possibly what, and develop leverage from there. So I think that is the danger that we face, that there will be a kind of reversion to mean that the incentives are clearly there on the German side to do that. And I'll stop with this final observation. I made this point after the conference. The following day, the minister-president of Lower Saxony popped up to actually say to the German media that the real solution is to repair Nord Stream 1 and get back to business. So I shall stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for this valuable view of how other things than just Russian internal structure could affect its role in Europe later on, and potentially also its the health of its energy sector, right? Because if Russia could export more gas to Germany, that would help possibly Gazprom or potentially even other companies. So that concludes our remarks, and we do have some questions from the audience. So I will start with those, and also if the panelists have additional comments or so, please let me know, and I will introduce those comments and provide for time to reflect. I think some of the questions relate to the Russia-China potential cooperation. And I think the question we have in the Q&A is about the power of Siberia. But I think there's a bigger question there. What will be the relation, and that maybe to Ambassador Herbst, what will be the relation, the geopolitical relation between Russia and China? Because it seems that the roles have kind of really turned. China and Russia have never been too close. They kind of now made to make up and start working together at a larger scale. But also the roles of the big brother and kind of really changed with China potentially having the lead here and the upper hand. Ambassador Herbst?
First, China certainly has the lead. And there have been many jokes about how small a Mladshi Brat Putin is to Xi, younger brother for those who don't speak Russian. Look, China and Russia historically have had difficult relations, which is normal when large powers share a long border. And so we are now witnessing the second Chinese-Russian rapprochement, geopolitical rapprochement, over the last 75 years. I remember well how long the last one lasted, maybe 10 to 15 years, and it ended up in war in the Russian Far East. Most commentators right now on Russian-China relations think that this is unparalleled cooperation, which is going to last for a long period of time, because both powers are driven by a strong anti-American agenda. They're right about that anti-American agenda. I think they're wrong about the length of the relationship. Even now, when the two are cooperating substantially, first of all, we've already talked about some of the limits on that cooperation, how China is using Russia's difficult circumstances to buy products at cheap prices. But something else China is doing gets very little attention. Chinese historians, journalists, and even one Chinese diplomat in Pakistan keep talking about Chinese territory, which is currently occupied by Russia, such as Vladivostok. So Chinese territorial ambitions in Russia are not hidden, even in this period of close cooperation. At some point, this relationship will come a cropper. It may well be in the aftermath of Putin's failed war in Ukraine, which I think is nearly certain as long as Western support for Ukraine does not diminish. And if a regime arrives in Moscow that is not imperialistic, is at least somewhat open, the fissures in the Chinese-Russian relationship will become quickly apparent, and there will be then an American rapprochement with Russia, with China as the odd man out.
Thank you, Ambassador. Kind of building on that, on the difficult relation, we have seen Power of Siberia coming up to deliver Russian gas to China. That's already built, expanding. We have a question about the full capacity. I don't think the capacity is 55 BCM. I think it's in the 30s, but I'll ask maybe Tatiana to kind of follow up on that. And also Russia is hoping for Power of Siberia too, which was its initial idea of bringing the gas that would otherwise go to Europe to China. I don't think China has yet to, I think China has yet to agree, but where is that relationship going, and what both countries are thinking, Tatiana?
Okay, you are right. Power of Siberia 1, it was built in 2019. It is now just increasing its capacity. Last year, it was 15.5 billion cubic meters exports, with the total nominal capacity of 38. So currently, it's utilized at less than half, and it is an inevitable part of the construction. So you spend 5 years to build a pipeline, and then you spend another 5 years to reach the projected capacity. It's a process which takes time. It will be applicable to the Power of Siberia 2 as well, if the contract will be signed. You are absolutely right, Anna. At the moment, it's just a number of memorandums of understanding. Gazprom has on its own prepared feasibility study, pushing China forward and making announcements like, look, we are ready, let's proceed. For the whole year 2022, China was absolutely silent, if not to say ignorant. And so today, this visit to Moscow, it's a very important landmark for the future of Power of Siberia too, because formally, it's a proper moment to sign the contract if China wants to proceed with this project. And at the same time, there could be other geopolitical games, so it can be postponed. China can simply ignore and not proceed with the project. So the uncertainty is huge, but I think we have to wait just for several hours to learn how it ends up, at least in this round. There is a third project under development. Sometimes it is called Power of Siberia 3. Sometimes they call it Eastern Route. Which is a 10 BCM pipeline to China from Sakhalin, the project which was agreed on like a week ago before Russia's invasion of Ukraine during Beijing Olympic Games. And now in December, the contract was signed already. So this is like a firm obligation. So 10 BCM through Eastern Route, 38 BCM through Power of Siberia 1, and potentially 50 BCM through Power of Siberia 2. This is on the table. Plus, Russia is discussing now, starting from mid-February, with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, creation of so-called triple side gas alliance, gas consortium. The idea is that Russia will supply gas to these countries, which are facing now gas deficit, and also use their gas infrastructure in order to transit gas to China, which could be a potential additional outlet for Russian gas. But basically, that's it. And as you can see here, it is China which decides when and which projects and at which scale will be introduced.
Right, and it seemed like that has been the case until China couldn't be the decider. It wasn't willing to pick up the conversation in 2014 when Russia has become kind of ousted by the West after its aggression in Ukraine. China picked up the conversation, and the Power of Siberia 1 or the first project has taken place. Thank you, Tatiana.
Yeah, and one additional comment, which is very important to keep in mind, which corresponds well to what Vladimir was saying. The price of gas exported through Power of Siberia 1 at the moment is approximately 10 times lower than the price of gas exports to Europe.
That's right. I mean, the cost that the Russian gas would have been at, it's definitely a very different one. Going to LNG, future LNG development, and Vladimir mentioned that Russia has increased its LNG exports to Europe. There are projects that are being developed, but Vladimir, from the geopolitical standpoint or from political standpoint, how would you treat if the LNG exports from Russia to Europe? There has been a suggestion that those exports should not be welcome. We do know that most of those exports actually come from Novatek, not from the state-owned company, but from privately owned company, which, like every company in Russia, of course, has to comply with the state. How do you think about that? About the increase in LNG exports to Europe? And what is the path going forward?
Thank you. And I would pick up on the previous discussion on China and bring in a little bit more economics here. Because when we discuss gas supplies to China, for instance, people are fascinated with routes and volumes. But if you actually look at the price, last year, Tatiana rightly said, Russia exported 15.5 BCM to China and of pipeline gas, and received for that a little less than $4 billion, which means that the average price over a year was $260 for 1,000 cubic meters. Under that price, Russia is making a huge loss, enormous loss from selling gas to China. They do not discover the financial results, but they do not disclose the financial results, but 9 years ago, when the contract was signed, the price that was discussed was 350, 380 corridor. And under that expected price, Gazprom openly wrote letters to government saying that the government has to zero out all the taxation for Power of Siberia. Otherwise, the project will not be able to make a profit under $350 per 1,000 cubic meters, meaning that all this fanfare about current supplies and turnover between Russia and China, it doesn't reflect the fact that supplies are loss-making. A similar situation with LNG, and I want to go back to Tatiana's argument that the industry, Russian industry, is resilient. Russian industry is indeed resilient, but there's this other elephant in the room, which is budget, government finances, which were the second biggest beneficiary of all these oil and gas exports to Europe. And industry might be resilient, but government finances are not. I disagree that Russia still has significant financial reserves. We'll probably see the end of them this year. Budget deficit in the first 2 months was 3 trillion rubles, and the remaining liquidity funds, real cash in the rainy day fund, the national wealth fund, is just 6. So only half of the remaining total cash reserves is equal to the deficit in just first 2 months of this year. What does it say about LNG? LNG does not generate any revenue for the Russian budget at all, zero. Whatever they sell to the European market, they're totally exempt from all taxes. And this is not a bug, it's a feature, because these extremely costly projects in the Arctic with big upfront investments, they cannot go on without zeroing out all the taxes. Meaning that however, whatever volumes of LNG Russia would export to Europe, will Europe prohibit it, sanction it or not? It makes no difference for government finances, only Gazprom's good old pipeline exports did. So neither LNG nor supplies to China can really help sustain government finances and lead some rents and profits towards the Russian budget. I think that's the crucial issue now, and that will have a profound long-term impact on Russia's ability to continue functioning as a petrol state. So LNG in this regard, yes, until Europe introduces sanctions, Russia might supply some volumes, which we saw last year and still seeing as of today, but this would not do any good to governments' finances and income. And also to finish about the LNG, further development of the LNG I see as being very seriously constrained by a lack of access to critical technology, which Chinese cannot provide us. It is a lot of it, like heat exchangers and other stuff, exists only in the West with Air Products and Linde and so on. There is a critical bottleneck about ARC-7 vessels for shipping the LNG, because South Korea dumped us. They won't be working with Russians anymore. And there is hardly any alternative, or at least the alternative which might deliver a significant amount of vessels relatively soon. So further LNG development is in peril because of lack of critical technology, and current LNG supplies make absolutely no difference because they don't deliver anything to the state budget.
Thank you, Vladimir. Appreciate that comment. Alan, how do you see the Russia-China relation and the triangle between, well, Russia, actually China and Europe, of course, but then also going forward the LNG expansion in Europe, but also from the Russian side? Do you have any comments or any of the comments that on the issues that came up?
I think you'd have to separate them out a little. Mm-hmm. Where I'd start with is the kind of the LNG dynamic between LNG producers, say the US or Qatar, for example, and European states. And what you see at the moment is that there's some of the West European states, I think for reasons, it's not just Germany, it's other European states, hesitate because of the transition obligations. But my underlying assessment of this is if you're replacing Russian gas, then there is no in principle problem, because you're not creating more CO2 emissions. You're just saying we won't be using Russian gas, we'll be using American or Qatari gas. And therefore you should be able to do the long-term supply contracts. So what you see is a difference is the UK, Central Eastern European states, not Hungary obviously, but others, the Baltic states are willing to do those deals. So far, Germany and France, the Netherlands, not so much. But we will see if that changes, because the underlying logic is pretty compelling as to why you should do that. On the China issues, I think the danger for Moscow, I suppose, is that there's a kind of double danger, really. The first is that as was already indicated, the price of gas you're going to get is so much lower than the European price. So you're paying, as I say, Power of Siberia 1, it's 10 times less than what Europe's paying. And that's true. But if once the Europeans begin to organize themselves with with more LNG from elsewhere and alternative diversification with renewables, nuclear, and so on, this issue I mentioned about the idea of creating a single purchaser, well, one of the arguments for the single purchaser is we need to have a price structure. We can impose a price. Well, one of the price structures we could look at is to follow the Chinese price and say, we will pay what the Chinese pay, and we can impose that on you. Now, as we're taking virtually no gas from Russia, we could do that. And I think one of the dangers for the overall Russian position is that what they end up finding is that they end up being a price taker on both sides of the Eurasian continent. So that essentially they're paying for, the price they're getting from the Chinese is low, and it turns out the price they're getting from the Europeans is low, and also restricted in volume for dependent security reasons. And of course, if the Europeans do that, you can imagine the Turks will demand the same sort of price. So what you end up with is perhaps the Chinese price, or price linked to Henry Hub, becoming the price at which is set for all Russian gas wherever it's sold. So you can see the Chinese leverage may be something which is a leverage which is then extends itself or is taken up by other powers, imposing that on Russia to all potential exporters. And I think that is a real danger with the system here. I also wonder how long it is uneconomic because of the costs of producing LNG in the far north. So one of the questions is that the pressure on the Russian budget to find some way of, if LNG continues to grow, of finding a way of putting some, increasing or beginning to tax some way the revenues from LNG when you're being constrained in other areas, must be something else which flows more of this. How the dynamics, I'm not sure, but you can see that there would be pressure to look at this when other avenues become much more difficult to access. And I think it is one of the constraints on the Russian state must be the sense that we're selling all this gas to the Chinese, but we're not making much money out of it. We're actually having, if you think about Power of Siberia 1, the capital costs of the development were around $50 to $60 billion. And they're getting the price 10 times less than the Europeans. That is a fairly difficult, I doubt they're making any money on those deals, given the capital costs. So that creates a whole series of kind of questions there for the future. I will stop there. There's lots more you could say, but
right, and I think there are two important things that you've mentioned. Is the fact that it's that the Chinese the deals or the prices could lead later to different prices in Europe, but it's only if Europe in fact creates infrastructure that through which it could access alternative supply. This is exactly what was lacking last year, and that's why we have seen the increase in floating LNG terminals and increase in pipeline activity with other countries. Now, I think the other thing that you mentioned that's really important is the long-term contracts, which will provide Europe with the certainty of bringing in specific supply. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned, that not all the contracts are alike. And for example, US contracts are very flexible. So you don't actually have to flow gas to Europe, bring the gas to Europe. You can bring it elsewhere while bringing alternative short-term kind of supply from Russia, for example, if the price is right. And that really, really helps. I think it matters. Just kind of before we end, I wanted to touch upon something that Vladimir mentioned, the energy transition, which I know also Tatiana has been looking at, and how Russia could develop into a country that not only relies on hydrocarbons. Vladimir, will it be possible, given that a lot of the funds that are being now used will not be there potentially going forward when the new Russia arises? How you imagine that happening?
Well, 20 years ago, we didn't have any funds at all, and the government was relying on encouraging private investment for development. And that was the time when we had the best economic growth. So we need to come back to the good old reformist days. I think, again, if there will be a responsible democratic government in Russia after Putin or his successors, the one major idea will be not to rely on government money anymore, not to rely on accumulating significant hydrocarbon rents, which are distorting political system and stimulating corruption and oligarchy. But that will be a system more focused on encouraging private investment instead. And Russia has a lot of competitive advantage. I mean, if you look just at the hundreds of competitiveness factors by the World Economic Forum listed in their global competitiveness report, like, skill, education, a lot of this stuff actually, which is essential for development of anything related to clean energy technologies, that is available. So we can be potentially competitive. It will really depend on the commitment of the new responsible government to carry out the right policies. So we don't need government money for that. This rainy day fund government money only create a lot of corruption, a lot of pressure. They never create any development, as we learned in the past 20 years. So that will be a whole different model based on competitiveness and private initiative and entering the international markets. And I think there's a good chance that this is going to work.
Many thanks, Vladimir. We have 1 minute before a break and next panel later following. But Tatiana, any last kind of remarks on the future, and then later Ambassador Herbst quickly?
Yeah, well, I agree with Vladimir that private entrepreneurship will be absolutely sufficient to develop all the renewable technologies for which Russia indeed has enormous potential. The problem is, meanwhile, with the current regime, it will cut further and further support schemes, and it will deteriorate any incentives for energy efficiency. If you have that much of cheap abundant gas, why the hell would you save it? Yeah. Or renewables, again, you have to burn coal somewhere because you cannot export it, and the coal mining cities are going mad. So unfortunately, for the near-term future, we will see most likely further reduction of the efficiency, more conventional energy balance with the increasing share of coal, oil, and gas instead of renewables, and less incentives for any climate-related action, because frankly, climate is now probably the last thing on the Russian domestic agenda, which is a very bad message for the whole world, given the size of Russian emissions.
Thank you, Tatiana. And Ambassador Herbst, please, any concluding remarks?
No, I'll pass. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everybody's comments. I think they were enlightening. They provided for different types of views from different viewpoints. We will have a very short break now for 4 or 5 minutes, and we have another panel that will look at the issues that from the European perspective rather than Russian here. So please stay, grab a coffee or a drink of water, and we'll see you in 4 or 5 minutes for the next panel with Benjamin. Thank you.
Can anybody hear me? Yes, I can hear you. This
Yeah,
is
I
Nicole.
have a question. This is Dick Morningstar. Oh,
Yeah.
is that Natalie?
Yeah, that's the same one.
Natalia? I wanted to ask somebody from the from Penn, if somebody else watches on my personal link, does that screw things up on another computer?
I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I think it, oh, it does. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, Ambassador, your personal link would allow someone to participate as a panelist.
Okay, so they can't, so somebody should not be on, like my wife should not be on that link in a
No,
separate
no,
computer.
but I'm happy to send you the main attendee link.
Okay, if you could send a link, let me give you the email address. F as in Frank, fmorningstar@yahoo.com.
Send that right now.
You got that? fmorningstar@yahoo.com. And who will it be coming from?
Bill Cohen.
Okay, thanks.
So we'll get started in just a second. Natalia and Ambassador Morningstar, if you could turn on your video. I know that Paul is also joining us shortly. We'll give it another minute or so.
The host is, I can't start the video because the host has disabled it.
Bill, can you give Ambassador Morningstar the ability to turn on his video? Or
okay, it's now saying I can start. All right. I'm on.
All right, we
now.
can see you. Thank you. Great. We'll just one more minute.
What's the order going to be? Not that I care.
So it will go you, Elena, Natalia, then Paul.
Okay. And Ben, does it make sense to show slides or better to like just talk through?
Yeah, we'll just have a discussion.
Okay,
Probably better.
no problem.
Yeah. And I know the audience is still here from the previous panel, so thank you all for bearing with our behind the scenes setup as we get ready for the second panel. About 30 seconds and we'll get started. Okay, thank you, everyone. Welcome. This is the panel 2 of a 2-part series that we're doing this morning. The Transatlantic Energy Landscape 1 year after Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. And for a moment of station identification, reminder, you are participating in not just this panel, but as a part of a conference called Penn Energy Week, a week-long multidisciplinary conference, marquee energy conference at the University of Pennsylvania, working at the intersection of science, technology, and energy policy. And this event is sponsored by the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, live from the end of Locust Walk, where I'm sitting at the Kleinman headquarters at the top of the Fisher Fine Arts Library here in Philadelphia, PA, in the University of Pennsylvania. So this panel will extend what we talked about in the previous panel. Anna and some great guests and experts spoke about basically European energy security from the Russian view. And right now, in this panel, we'll talk about countering Russian energy weaponization from Lisbon to Kyiv, sanctions, export controls, and physical infrastructure protection. To give a bit of context, since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine commenced in February of last year, the Kremlin's long-term strategy of weaponizing energy resources and infrastructure dependence against Western democratic norms has reached its apex. In a lot of ways, you can borrow the tagline from the Masters golf tournament: Russian energy weaponization, a tradition unlike any other. It's been a long-term policy of Moscow. The Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin has notoriously used energy as a political weapon aimed at extracting geopolitical concessions from democracies across the European continent through real and threatened natural gas cutoffs for years. The Kremlin intentionally created natural gas crisis in the year running up to its reinvasion of Ukraine to undermine EU foreign policy latitude. And over the past year, it's conducted even more dramatic wartime energy weaponization, including major gas cutoffs across the European Union and maritime activities near European offshore energy infrastructure that raise transatlantic security concerns. Most distressing of all, of course, is the fact that for the past 6 months or so, the Russian military has conducted kinetic, missile, rocket, and kamikaze drone attacks against Ukrainian civil energy infrastructure aimed at exacerbating the wartime humanitarian crisis for Ukrainian civilians this winter. And of course, we've seen from low Earth orbit the NASA Worldview satellite showing basically this impact, the darkened Ukraine with all of the lit up countries around the Ukrainian periphery, showing that disparity and the impact of those those acts, which Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has rightly dubbed energy terrorism. And so what we will talk about in this panel is how do we support Ukraine in terms of physical energy resiliency, and also how do we push back on Russian energy weaponization, and in particular, most concerningly and most urgently, getting more sanctions and more technology export controls focused on the energy sector to limit Russia's ability to conduct its aggression against Ukraine. So I can't think of a better set of panelists to talk about this than who we have assembled for this panel. We'll start with Ambassador Richard Morningstar. I'll do quick introductions and then go through the panelists. We first have Ambassador Richard Morningstar, the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center and a board director at the Atlantic Council. He served as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Azerbaijan from July 2012 to August 2014. He's also been ambassador to the EU and many other posts, including coordinator for European energy security and global energy security issues at the State Department. We'll then have Elena Pavlenko, the chair of the PWYP Global Council and president of Dixie Group, a Kyiv, Ukraine-based think tank specializing in research and consultations in the energy sphere. Then we'll have Natalia Shapoval, vice president for policy research at the Kyiv School of Economics and head of the KSE Institute. Natalia has 10 years of experience in policy research and consulting in projects in public procurement, the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, and strategic development of the private sector. And last but certainly not least, Paul Massaro, senior advisor for sanctions and counter-corruption at the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Helsinki Commission on Capitol Hill in Washington. He is the senior policy advisor for counter-corruption and sanctions. His work has advanced the recognition of corruption as a national security threat. He's been described in the media as, quote, one of America's foremost corruption experts, and, quote, an endless source of democratic ingenuity. And I'll add a endless source of positive energy for the transatlantic relationship. Paul, so great to see you there. And just so I don't forget to introduce myself, I'm Benjamin Schmidt. I'm a senior fellow here at the University of Pennsylvania at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy and also at the Department of Physics and Astronomy. I'm working in a joint academic position between a number of experimental cosmology projects at the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Penn and also on European energy security here at the Kleinman Center. So with that, I will first go for opening remarks. We'll go Ambassador Morningstar, Elena Pavlenko, Natalia Shapoval, and then Paul Massaro. So Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's really good to see you, and even if virtually. And congratulations on your new position at Penn. Let me maybe try to set an overall context, and possibly I'll be overly simplistic, but we'll see where it goes. I think one of the most important things that we have to remember as a reality is that sanctions are not a zero-sum game. And sometimes I think it's treated as such. Some would say that since energy sanctions have not stopped the war, that they're a failure. Others might say that the combination of price caps and together with the European oil embargo, that's helped to avoid major spikes in price and major spikes in Russian revenue, thereby reducing what might have been their revenue. And it's also helped to stabilize oil markets so that they've been a success. I don't think you can look at sanctions in terms simply it's either failed, that they've either failed or that they've been successful. One, it depends to some extent on your objectives, but I would argue that it's somewhere in between, and that sanctions need to be increased, as you indicated in your opening, because even if they don't stop the war, they're going to reduce Russian revenues and make it more difficult for Russia on an increasing scale to pursue the war. So what can be done? What can we be done in the shorter term to help increase the effectiveness of sanctions? One, we can reduce the price caps for both crude and refined oil products. The price on crude, for example, can be reduced significantly below $60 a barrel. Russia has sold at $60 a barrel for much of the last several years, and they're already discounting the price of much of Russian oil, at least Ural oil and so forth, already below $60. And the marginal, there's always a debate on what's the marginal cost of production of Russian oil. Well, it's significantly less than $60, and the price caps can be reduced significantly and still be above the marginal cost of production, which would create an incentive for Russia to produce if the idea is to keep some Russian oil on on the market. A second area that we need to strengthen is stricter enforcement of sanctions that are in effect, sanctions on any shipping or insurance companies that are transiting Russian oil above a price cap. And Ben, you're one of the leading experts on that, and you can describe specific steps as we did and you did the writing of this part in our joint article recently on foreign policy, but it's something that we need to look at very closely. A third area is and I hadn't recognized this as much until recently, but the transfer of oil field services in Russia. There are still companies that are providing oil field services, which are helping Russian production. And I would argue that the existing transfer of technology sanctions must be clarified and increased to include oil products, oil fuel services, and that Western companies that are still doing things in Russia should be sanctioned. Another area that needs to be looked at is that all gas going to Europe should be ended, including LNG. And also, apparently, a lot of Asian countries, friendly Asian countries who are part of the coalition are still buying significant amounts of Russian energy, particularly gas, and I think that has to be looked at as well. So those are the kinds of things I think we have to consider. I think, again, don't think of sanctions as zero sum. Don't think because Russia is still conducting the war that sanctions are useless or are failing. The more we do, the more of an effect on Russia, even if it still continues to conduct the war. Back to you, Ben.
Sorry, I was having an issue with my mouse. Thank you so much. Those are great opening remarks. I agree with basically everything you said, and I suspect I'll agree with what all the panelists are about to say. And so we'll next go to Olena. Olena, over to you for your opening remarks, about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. And it's a great pleasure to be at the same panel with so great panelists. It's hard to talk after the Ambassador Morningstar because he actually took a lot of my notes I wanted to say, but I will try to complement with some more ideas. First of all, I definitely agree that we cannot say that sanction was a failure or other problem or created any other problems. Sanctions work. And if you look at the budget deficit of Russia for the two first months, which actually Vladimir Milov already said, it's now counted $34 billion. It's 80% of Russian annual budget deficit. With this, if Russian budget deficit will be, let's say, $80 billion, Russians will use their national welfare fund by the end of the year. Yes, it has around $155 billion, but again, as Mr. Milov said already, the accessible money are around $80 billion, which is exactly will be needed to cover the annual budget deficit. So probably if Russia still will loses so much money as it loses now, by the end of the year, they just simply will not have money. If they don't have money, they will not be able to invest into the production. If they cannot invest into production, they will not be able to produce and to sell oil, gas, and other products, energy products, which they used then as a weapon against Europeans, against Ukrainians, and others. But yes, we still can do more because Russia still earns some money from selling oil, gas, and other energy. First, I agree with Ambassador Morningstar, we have to reduce price caps. And we think that Europe and G7 can easily go to $30 for oil from 60. it still be sufficient for Russia to produce, but still will reduce a lot of revenues and profit from their business. I understand that some of the politicians might say that Russia might again manipulate with the volumes. You remember that they did it with gas in 2021 when they sent less volumes to Europe, and it led to the higher prices on gas. Russia tried to do this with oil by the end of 2022. It didn't work. So I think this threats, or Russian formula, as I say, minus volume plus price, will not work anymore in Europe or for the world prices on oil and gas. What other sanctions we can use? We didn't talk about nuclear sector today. I understand that quite a lot of countries will say that no, we cannot now impose sanctions on nuclear sector because we still use Russian fuel and there is still a long-term business. Nevertheless, if you look at the results of Russian business in nuclear sector in 2022, they even got 20% more than in previous years. So they're just developing their business in nuclear sector right now in the middle of the war. And what can be done actually is European countries and US actually, they can stop building new nuclear power plants by Russian Rosatom in third countries. How to do this? There are a number of European companies and actually General Electric as well, who supply Rosatom with different equipment for the new nuclear power plants. Siemens supplies some process control systems. And if you look at the latest news, you will see that there are already tensions whether Siemens will supply this to Hungarian nuclear power plant or Turkish, which Rosatom is going to build. French companies, Framatome, A-Systems, they also supply Rosatom with some technologies. And General Electric supplies Rosatom with turbine generators based on the beautiful word Arabelle technology. So I think if the Western companies decide to put some sanctions in nuclear sphere, they can start from negotiating with their companies not to allow them to supply necessary equipment for building new nuclear power plants. And again, how to do this? Russia used nuclear power plant in Ukraine, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as a weapon. It uses it now as a weapon. So if every company which supplies Russia with equipment to the nuclear power plant can support actually Russia in using then this nuclear power plant as a weapon. So it might be considered as a supplying Rosatom with a dual use equipment. And I think it can be a reason to consider whether governments will allow or not to allow companies to supply such equipment. And third proposition is, I heard what actually Professor Riley said about possible common purchase of Russian gas for Europe. Even if it happens, actually, there should be a very clear mechanism to see how Russia uses the revenues which it receives from this business. Everybody should ensure that this money will go not for war, not for, I don't know, some violations of human rights, but for renewable technologies, what Mr. Milov said, or energy efficiency or other issues. So this spending of money should be very transparent and accountable for all the world. And regarding support to Ukraine, we'll be happy to elaborate on this more during the Q&A. I will just say that Ukraine is really will need three types of support now in energy sector. First is immediate support with equipment, with anything which will allow to keep our energy system workable. Second is investments into critical infrastructure. We have to restore our electricity system. And the losses, damages actually calculates around $2 billion already. And third is business development. Ukraine will face huge energy poverty after the war, and we will have to think how to balance rebuilding the processes and also supporting people with different supporting mechanisms, including energy sector. And here we will definitely need a lot of investments, business support, and also support from partner countries to elaborate, to somehow organize the business climate in Ukraine. Thank you. I'll stop here and we'll be happy to answer all the questions.
Thank you so much, Elena. And over to you, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this opportunity to speak. So we already observe, and I think everyone on the panel here, that there is effect of the energy sanctions on Russia. Both we see it in terms of export revenues. They are lower each month, basically. In January, it was lower than average of the last year. In February, it's lower than in January. In February, it was around $11 billion a month, while before they had numbers around 14 and even 17, 18 in 2022. Budget revenues are falling, and over the last 2 months, the budget revenues fell like 46%. It was a drama in the news. Given the new changes in the policy of the Ministry of Finance, it will be not that dramatic in the next months. However, it still will be dramatic. And our forecast is that for the next year, for the 2023, Russia gonna lose around half of their export revenues as compared to the last year. And with the current level of the price cap, it's gonna be something like 170 billion for the year, versus last year it was more than 350 billion. So it's a big change. However, it's not enough actually. And Russia faces crisis when the export revenue go like below 150 billion. And therefore, it's really critical to reduce the price cap ASAP and not wait, because every month basically makes this impact. With the current level of the price cap, again, there will be budget. There will be budget deficit, but there will be current account surplus, and it will be like around $80 billion, which is still substantial. And we want to reduce all this current account surplus. We want to reduce the budget revenues more, so that the financial situation, economic situation in Russia changes dramatically this year, and they actually don't have enough foreign currency for purchases that they do of the military equipment and paying the military. They need like at least $8 billion every year, every month, basically, to finance the war. Sometimes they seem to be using a higher amount. And for now, the export revenues can easily cover this every month in terms of monetary value. So I agree very much with Ambassador Morningstar, with Olena in their proposals, what should be done next. I would like to emphasize that it's critical to do as fast as possible, because every month, we are losing the opportunity to get Russia this year to the situation when it's really operationally difficult to conduct the war. And it's very bad, because I'm sure that Ukrainian military forces have all the chances to kick out Russians from the territory of Ukraine this year with proper support. And this, timing that we extend has actually very big cost for Ukrainian people, but also for the global South and the whole world economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And last but not least, Paul.
Great. Well, that's a hard act to follow up. Those are some wonderful panelists. I'm calling you here from Sofia, Bulgaria, and actually I'm at a conference that I think has a lot of intersections with what we're doing today. And I guess I want to endorse what everybody else has said. I think we need to do those things. I really want to endorse what Ambassador Morningstar said about sanctions, because I think that, in fact, sanctions work if they are imposed, which of course we haven't imposed sanctions, even sanctions passed by Congress to hit Nord Stream 2. up until like today. And even today, there are a lot of sanctioned loopholes. So, I mean, there's a lot more we could be doing. There's some inexplicable gaps in sanctions. I mean, I think the explanation in a lot of cases is in order to maintain G7 unity. I think there are definitely still those who imagine one day returning to some sort of status quo with Russia or some sort of business as usual. And I guess that's kind of what I want to talk to, is look at some of this, corruption aspect, how this happened in the past, and how we can prevent it in the future. So obviously the energy dependence of Europe on Russia was not an accident. It was a ingenious ploy of Russia using numerous different corrupt methods, co-opting of officials, laundering an inordinate sum of money and making sure it got in the right pockets of various elites. I think the way we've kind of described this before, Ben and I, who have written about this and done a lot of work over this, and of course, Ben is an even bigger Nord Stream 2 expert than I am. But I want to say we've called this elite capture, and I think that's exactly right. I think that's the way it needs to be described, because that's how Russia was able to get away with it, is essentially by making a handful of very well-connected people very rich in order to make their countries addicted to Russian gas, and also sort of laundering their policies into the United States. So there was a time when, by co-opting German interests and co-opting German figures and German industry groups and German think tanks, Russia was actually able to push its message into the USA via Germany. Obviously, if you show up in a congressional office as Russia, and saying you're representing Russia or some of the oligarchs, at least since 2014, the USA is going to kind of shake its head at you. But if you come near the Germans, then the door is open, and then it's, we need to talk about this, and we don't want to damage the relationship or anything like this. So, the Russians really did an extraordinary job making Europe dependent upon them, making Germany in particular dependent upon them, and they did this through corruption. That's how they did it. I mean, ultimately, and I think Annalena Baerbock, current foreign minister of Germany, has said it best, in that the Germans paid, they may have felt like they were getting a deal, may have felt like they were paying low cost for the gas, but they paid in national security, they paid in values, they paid in the security of Europe. I mean, it's because of Nord Stream 2, it's because of this corruption that Russia thought it had, friends in Europe and Western Europe. It thought it thought that Western Europe and the United States would not respond to its attack on Ukraine. What it didn't reckon with, of course, is that Ukrainians would protect themselves, and they did. And then we were forced to respond. I think Russia ultimately was right. I think its energy dependency, in a sense, the energy dependency of Europe, the corruption that it had weaponized and gotten into European elites, the way to capture European elites, would have prevented the West from responding to basically a fait accompli in Ukraine. But because it wasn't a fait accompli, we're where we are now, and we got a second chance at holding to our values and holding to our own interests and getting rid of some of this corruption. So going forward, in order to actually accomplish, I think, what a lot of the other panelists have talked about with regard to energy, we need to start to root out some of the elite capture. We need to pass the laws required to ensure that our people are not working for Russia. This has never been more important. It's extremely hard to do. You're up against vested interests. Of course, Congress has given it its best shot. Just last Congress, a law was passed that will prevent former secretaries and deputy secretaries of state from ever working for a foreign country in any capacity. That is also working for, let's say, a German industry association or something like this, that is pushing a corrupt pipeline project. And it also gives a 3-year cooling off period for all other positions. So never for secretary and deputy secretary, and then also never for 6 countries of concern, which include Russia and China, Iran. And this is a huge accomplishment, because the way this law is written, it would prevent advising and consulting as well. So it's not just kind of an amendment to the Foreign Agents Registration Act or the Lobbying Disclosure Act. It would just prevent this outright. So it would actually prevent the massive lobbying that went on for Nord Stream 2 in the United States. So that's a huge deal. Now, we also have been working on the SHAME Act, which, Ben is the intellectual father of. He wrote a piece in Foreign Policy about this. And basically the way it's written right now, and this is sort of the chair and co-chair of the Helsinki Commission, Joe Wilson and Steve Cohen, it would prevent anybody from accepting compensation for lobbying for adversaries. And now this is particularly lobbying and not just looking at foreign officials, but all lobbyists. And this is an amendment to FARA and the LDA. So it would still be kind of stuck in the standing law. It doesn't go further than that, but it would hit everybody and not just former officials. And then finally, I want to mention the Enablers Act, which would, finally create due diligence requirements for lawyers and accountants, trust and company formation agents, investment advisors in the United States, who have basically been able to unscrupulously accept money from foreign interests since forever. I mean, there's no requirement to actually, no legal requirement to screen anyone you're doing business with. So, I mean, one can see how with this lack of regulation and essentially this festering culture of corruption and elite capture in Washington, D.C., and even worse somehow in Berlin, that Russia was able to get its way in both make Europe dependent upon it in energy sources, and then also prevent a strong U.S. response, with it, which again, Congress had passed twice, and these sanctions still weren't imposed.
Thanks so much, Paul. I will go right back to you just to define, since you're the Capitol Hill is, I think, king of acronyms. What does the SHAME Act stand for before we go to the broader questions?
Well, the SHAME Act, as introduced by Congress, stands for Stop Helping Adversaries Manipulate Everything Act.
All right, excellent. Excellent.
The Enablers Act is the Establishing New Authorities for Business Laundering and Enabling Risks to Security Act.
Okay, excellent. So any students that might be watching that might be thinking of a future in policy and lawmaking, you have to also kind of be good at crosswords and things like that, because that's a big help in selling these pieces of legislation.
It's all about the names.
It's all about the names, but even more important with the content, which is really good at pushing back on Russian energy weaponization through elite capture and strategic corruption. So, okay, first question of this panel, I want to go around to each of you. We'll go in the same order, starting with Ambassador Morningstar, then Elena, then Natalia, then Paul. What are the top priorities right now? And I will say that Natalia, Ambassador Morningstar, and I are in the Stanford sanctions group that's chaired by Michael McFall, Ambassador Michael McFall out at Stanford University. And we've written about this, but I know that everyone on this panel has thought and written and talked about this. Top priorities for energy sanctions in particular, because as we've heard, there's the oil price cap that I think everyone has said, and I certainly agree, needs to be dropped well below the $60 per barrel level as quickly as possible, even if it's operating properly in the short term, just to limit as much Russian revenue as quickly as possible, closer to the marginal cost of production, which right now is arguably around $25, $30, something like that. But we're still missing a lot of sanctions, right? There was the United States coming out, President Biden 3 weeks after the war began, embargoing all Russian hydrocarbon imports. So oil, gas, coal, everything coming into the United States. We then saw this happen at the end of last year, end of 2022 in the EU. But we still haven't seen the sort of energy sanctions regimes, secondary sanctions, things like this, that I think are needed. And that goes for both the resource, both the hydrocarbons that Russia makes its funds, that it's able to fund its aggression against Ukraine with, but also the energy technologies. So that's that sort of thing that can be addressed through technology export control. So I just want to kind of go through top lines on what can we be doing now to help Ukraine by sanctioning Russia and pushing back on Russia's energy weaponization to the greatest extent possible. Ambassador Morningstar, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. When looking at priorities, I think I outlined in my opening what I see as the priorities, and I don't think I need to repeat them again. But I think those are all priorities, as well as I think the nuclear sanctions are also, which I didn't mention, should be at the top of the list. I mean, I'd love, part of me, maybe a lot of me, would love to see an overall worldwide oil and gas embargo, but I don't think that's going to happen politically. So I think that the best we can do right now and prioritize are the things that we've already talked about. But I do want to make another point, that there's a flip side to the sanctions issue. It's not just increasing sanctions that we need to do. The second issue is, how do we respond to what's going on now? What's Europe doing, for example? And is Europe doing enough? And I think Europe's done a pretty good job, in spite of their history of being, dependent on Russian energy, and I think the points on corruption are very much in line. But Europe's had a lucky winter. It's been warm, but they've also significantly reduced demand, and the Chinese economy had not really recovered during up until now, but the problem is beginning to recover now, and Europe may have a tougher time next winter. So I think in any discussion, we have to also look at what's Europe doing to increase the availability of gas, particularly LNG, which I think they're doing quite a bit and getting more than they had originally been projected. New LNG terminals, floating terminals, so forth and so on. Doubling down on gas infrastructure, recognizing that gas is going to be important certainly for the midterm and maybe longer. But one thing we also have to recognize is that the energy transition relates directly to energy security. And the greater the energy transition, the greater renewables and other forms of new technologies, the less dependence on fossil fuels creates the less potential dependence on a sole supplier like Russia. So we have to look at the need for gas and the need for doubling down on the energy transition as not an either-or proposition, but that both are necessary. More gas and more green technology. And that the greater the green technology, the greater, not only is that critical from a climate standpoint, but also from an energy security standpoint. And we have to continue to make that link. So from a priority standpoint, I think there are the individual steps on sanctions that we need to move ahead as quickly as possible, but we also have to double down on new technologies to reduce dependence and create greater energy security, along with whatever climate benefits.
Excellent. We'll talk about on the next round of questions, timescales for the transition and sanctions and how they interplay. But I think that's a really excellent point. Elena, over to you.
Thanks. If we talk about three priority sanctions and the most realistic, let's say, ones, I would say first, in March, actually, the G7 and EU had a chance to review the price caps. So if they could still do this, that would be great. It's still, the mechanism actually allows to review and reduce the price cap, and they could do this this month. So if they can do this still in March, that would be great. Second, price caps on gas, potentially LNG, something which demands consensus among G7 and the EU countries. If they can agree on themselves, that would be great. And I think it's very realistic. And third is what I said, nuclear. I understand that it's still hard to totally stop cooperation with Rosatom. But first, you can stop supplying technologies for building new nuclear power plants, and I showed you how Western countries can do this. their regulators might not allow companies to supply these technologies. And second is building or developing a roadmap how to get rid of Russian nuclear fuel. Even if it is impossible to do it within 1 year, it is still possible to develop a roadmap and agree that, let's say, we will need 3 years, and after 3 years, we will use other types of nuclear fuel, and we will do this. I think this is what Western countries can start doing now.
Great. Natalia?
To add to what has been said already, I think the monitoring of implementation of sanctions is critical, because when we say that Russian export revenue should be lower, it means that someone going to be getting this arbitrage. So in countries like India and China and many elsewhere, there would be basically a situation where some oil is 30 or 40 or 50% is more expensive than another kind of oil. And it's very important from my perspective to be able to watch what's going on and who are making these transactions, because it's maybe not such a big problem if it goes to Indian government and they spend less on subsidies because of this for population. But another situation if Russians are able to accumulate it, on their accounts. And for this, I think it's critical to have further sanctions on the enterprises in the military, in the energy sector, but also on the Gazprom Bank and other banks. Potentially, and this is what we proposed in one of our papers of the Yermak-McFall group, probably there should be only one partially unsanctioned bank, and everything else should be sanctioned, like at some point it was with Iran, so that Gazprom Bank would all be able to do transactions on oil and gas that are allowed. I think this pairing between the financial and energy sanctions is very important. Otherwise, we will have a lot of basically money, cash that is on some Russian accounts, and through this they can be bribing, politicians. With other sanctions, I totally agree. It's very nice that colleagues said it. Just signed for everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And Paul.
Sure. So I guess, again, I endorse what the other three panelists said. I want to make a kind of broader strategic point on this and kind of say, we need to decide that we want Ukraine to win the war, which I don't quite believe we've decided yet. I think that in the G7, there's still kind of this, well, we don't want Ukraine to lose. We don't want Russia to win. We're not sure if we want Ukraine to win, because that would require retaking Crimea. It may lead to the disintegration of Russia. It's for some, there's a lot of sort of geopolitical consequences that seem scary, because they've been sort of sort of not thought through or overthought, or maybe a combination of the two, but kind of this warmed over thinking of, do we really want to win the war? It's like, wow. I mean, I sort of can't believe we find ourselves even asking the question, in a sense. But there's a lot more we can be doing, we should be doing, but we don't do. And the reason we don't do it is because we have sort of fear of victory. So, I mean, if we really threw everything we had at this problem, the war would be won already. I mean, the Ukrainians are certainly have the spirit, are going to fight. They want to win. Now we need to want to win. Which we all indications are we don't know that this is what we want yet. I mean, some of us certainly, but I don't think that's where the administration is. I don't think that's where Berlin is at the moment. So I think that we need to have some discussions about, our expected outcomes and our goals here.
Great, thanks, Paul. So for the next question, I'm going to stick with you, Paul. I'm going to go in reverse order, and then we'll go to the Q&A from the audience. I want to talk quickly and switch from sanctions to Ukrainian energy resiliency and critical infrastructure protection, and that speaks to something you brought up, Paul, in terms of not only what you've said on this panel, but your tireless public advocacy for more weapons and military support for Ukraine. So I guess the question is, pick either of these panelists. What more physical infrastructure protection measures can Ukraine take? And that includes things like air defense and military sort of equipment that can be helping the energy security situation and potentially mitigating future energy poverty, as was said in Ukraine. And also, what are the priorities for rebuilding Ukraine's energy infrastructure, not only from an energy security standpoint, but from a sustainability and climate crisis addressing standpoint? So Paul, Elena, Natalia, Ambassador Morningstar.
Okay, sure. Well, I'll take that first one then. I'll see how I do here. I mean, look, the best defense is offense. I mean, in some sense, we need to see the counteroffensives happen. We need to win the war. I mean, that's kind of like we absolutely need to give Ukraine more air defense. Air defense is critical, but in some sense, the only way that this ends is by ending it, and you need to give Ukraine ATACMS. Right. I mean, you need to give Ukraine long-range missiles, which you need to give them F-16s. You need to give them everything they ask for, really. But I mean, ATACMS in particular change the way the entire war is fought, right? Because when we think about, okay, so what has destroyed critical energy infrastructure? Well, it's these Russian missiles. It's largely attacks launched from either Crimea, with temporarily occupied Crimea, or other occupied Ukrainian territory, or Russian territory, right? Which the best thing you can do to stop these missile launches is to blow up the areas that they're being launched from, and the way you do that is with long-range missiles. So I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer, but once again, we've kind of talked ourselves into a corner with this notion of well, is Ukraine going to use them to hit Russian territory? Is Russian territory off limits? Is Russian territory allowed? Is Crimea allowed? I mean, all these kinds of discussions have essentially, in the endless kind of circular debate we have about them, have enabled this situation in which Russia's just like, okay, great. Well, while you guys are debating this, we're going to blow up Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And I mean, that's what needs to be done. But again, I think it comes back to my last statement that we need to decide we need to decide if we want Ukraine to win. I want Ukraine to win. I hope we want Ukraine to win. But if we want Ukraine to win, then we need to give them ATACMS, like yesterday.
Right, and Paul, just for the audience, in case folks don't know, what are ATACMS?
They're these long-range missiles, the Army tactical missile, but they're really they can hit up to 300 kilometers. Which, and one of the reasons why they'd be so impactful, as opposed to some of this other gear, like these small diameter bombs that can hit 150 kilometers, is because apparently those are going to take, we need to build an entire logistical chain for those. They won't be able to reach until fall, and they're only 150 kilometers, whereas ATACMS are there, can be supplied, can be immediately used with HIMARS systems. So it could really change counteroffensive operations like tomorrow. Again, all this stuff should have been supplied before Russia invaded, or at least immediately after, but here we are.
All right, thanks, Paul. Elena, over to you.
Thanks. I definitely agree with Paul. To stop the war as soon as possible, to win the war as soon as possible, we need weapon and we will need air defenses. Because when you have a ballistic missile hitting our thermal power plant, what you can do, you will just write down additional number in your damages into the energy infrastructure. That's all. So you have to not only protect your energy infrastructure, you have to be able to, to answer, I'm sorry, for such damages. So first, missiles and air defense systems to stop the war, to win the war as soon as possible. And just a few more words on this. I think the quicker Ukraine wins the war, the better it would be also for Europe, for the US, and for others, because you can see what Russians are doing now with China and what China is doing with Russians. Because Russians are losing the war, they agree more and more to be dependent from China. And after the war, let's say in autumn, yes, you will have Russia totally dependent on China, which will be much more complicated task to deal with if it just destroyed Russia, if it's just Russia which lost the war as an independent state. And regarding the rebuilding of Ukraine and rebuilding energy infrastructure, I can talk a lot about this, but maybe I will focus on several issues. First is decentralized system. We understand that our centralized energy system actually is vulnerable. So we have to develop much more complicated, much more decentralized system. And now is the right time to do this. And if international partners can help us to build this new system, new approach, it would be really, really helpful for our future energy security. Second is definitely new technologies. And here we talk not only energy efficiency or energy saving technologies, but also about nuclear, new nuclear technologies, small modular reactors, anything which will allow us to be actually ahead of the time to produce electricity, to supply it not only to Ukraine, but also to Europe. I saw the great questions in the chat, we'll be happy to answer later. Second, third is support at the national and local level, because if you will definitely deal with the critical infrastructure on the national level, but you cannot rebuild country without rebuilding cities and local communities. And to be able to do this in energy sector, you have to work with local communities, with cities, with local governments to help them to build their local energy infrastructure in place. This is a really very complicated task because you have a huge country with huge territory, with a lot of communities. But if we do this, we actually will have a really great electricity, secured, resilient system. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Elena. Natalia?
Yeah, so I totally agree that defense and weapons are the first priority. I would add a little bit different dimension other speakers didn't talk about, and this is like fast recovery, because there are regions that were recently deoccupied, or like Kharkiv region or Kherson region, and these are tens of communities that still are kind of close to the front line or were recently deoccupied, and they don't have access to the basic energy, electricity, and heating, and therefore it's almost not livable there. And this is another big priority, to have this fast recovery going on so that people actually, you know, can live and have very basic public services, that there some symptoms of schools and healthcare facilities can work. So this is already ongoing, but I would like to highlight that this is very important part of overall resilience of people, especially in these territories. We are running estimates of the damages to the infrastructure of Ukraine, maybe from the third day of war. And right now, our estimates is that the whole energy sector had a direct damage to infrastructure, and the recovery cost is around $8 billion. So just to show you how huge it is. I think like to redo it properly, it would be even more. But right now, like the first priority is at least to have basic needs where it's needed. Thank you.
Okay, and Ambassador Morningstar. Thank you, Natalia.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, on the weapons side, I'm by no means a security expert or, you know, an expert on what weapons can be sent and not sent and so forth. I do have the sense that we can be more aggressive, that we can get things to Ukraine more quickly, and that the security strategists have to look realistically at how much more we can do without risking serious escalation. For example, if we provided Ukraine with weapons that could penetrate Russia, that could create, you know, that's the kind of thing that could create dangerous escalation. But that doesn't mean we can't do more. And the real experts have to figure out what we can do and measure those risks, but not be, you know, not be too reticent, which I think maybe we are now. I think on the energy infrastructure issue, we have to look at things from a time frame standpoint. And I agree with what, you know, with what Elena and Natalia have been saying. But we first have to look at the most immediate time frame. How do we make sure that sufficient gas and oil get into Ukraine? How do we cooperate with Black Sea countries to ship product into Ukraine? How do we get to Ukraine immediately all of the parts and equipment necessary to help replace damaged infrastructure? That right now is the #1 priority. I do agree that there are some things that we can begin to look at now. I think Elena pointed that out. With respect to the grid system and so forth, I think obviously that's important, and we should do those things that we can do that won't just simply be erased by Russian attacks on infrastructure. And then look at the longer term as to the Ukraine of the future from the standpoint of clean energy, new nuclear technologies, which I think we can start working on now. Ukraine is a major electricity supplier back into Europe, and we could go on and on. But Ukraine has a tremendous potential that can be developed if we can come to some kind of stability in the country.
Great, thank you, Ambassador Morningstar. Okay, so we started about 5 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to push this to 11:05 to wrap things up. But going into what I'll call the lightning round, of course, PEN's founder, for those of you who don't know, is a guy by the name of Benjamin Franklin, our original science diplomat of this country, in my opinion, and of course did famous experiments with lightning that have direct impact on our understanding of electricity and energy and things like this. So I think it's fitting to do a quick lightning round. So I'm going to take some of the questions from the audience and give them to a pair of panelists each. So the first one is this question that comes in and says, is it true that Schlumberger is still operating in Russia and didn't exit? What implications on sanctions and the exit of service companies would this have on Russia's short, medium, and long-term oil production? And question that I would have on top of that is, companies that are still operating, should the West start considering not just naming and shaming and public pressure, but also considering secondary sanctions? So I'm going to go to Natalia and then Paul on this question.
Yes, so Schlumberger, according to our data, is still working in Russia. And this is kind of a big deal. I think this kind of companies should be a part of sanctions on the energy sector. Many kind of services are already sanctioned to provide for the oil and gas industry for Russia. And this also should be the case here. Then there is a problem, I think, for the companies who didn't leave on time, because right now Putin made it very difficult for companies to leave. They need to go, if they are very strategic or if they are bank, they would need Putin to sign off on them to make any kind of transaction or to leave Russia or to sell their asset. However, there are still ways to do it, and I think companies should be increasingly encouraged and to do so, to write off their assets, because they do not have any control of that anymore. I don't think that we should impose like sanctions. I think still have hope that it should be done by like proper encouragement and a request to expose this information. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. Paul?
Sorry, Ben, could you repeat the question? There's a company still doing business there?
Yeah, there's a number of companies, including Schlumberger, that are still providing oil and gas technology services to the Russian Federation. What should be the sanctions implications? Should there be sanctions? Should there just be more public pressure to get these companies out of Russia?
There should be sanctions if there aren't sanctions. If there are sanctions, they should be enforced. I mean, this feels like such a no-brainer. I mean, it seems to just be, some kind of handouts to favorite companies in order to, again, maintain G7 cohesion. I don't really understand it, and I think it cuts holes in our ability to actually, cause effects against the Russian military machine.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Last question in the lightning round is going to Elena, then Ambassador Morningstar. I'm going to take Max's and Aaron's questions as one. Your views on Europe's unwillingness to sign long-term LNG contracts, presumably not with Russian firms elsewhere in the world, whether this is a sign that Europe does not rule out going back to Russian gas in the future, and shouldn't a full ban of Russian gas be considered for every long-term contract per BCM of LNG that the EU has, BCM to BCM trade-off? So Elena and then Ambassador Morningstar.
Maybe I'll start from Aaron's issue on nuclear, because he said that probably nuclear does not provide so much revenues for Russia than oil and gas, which I agree. I think it's around 10 billion per year. But the problem is that nuclear is much more strategically important for the future. If Russia builds nuclear power plants in South Africa, and then it controls this nuclear power plant, and then if it says to government of South Africa, for example, that if you do not do what we want, we will blow up your nuclear power plant, or we will not produce electricity there, or something else, then you will have South Africa controlled by Russians. So, and you can imagine where else Russia is going to build. You can see actually where else Russia is going to build such nuclear power plants: in Central Asia, in Latin America, in Africa as well. So consider this as a more strategic issue, not just the revenues for Russia. Regarding the LNG contracts, I definitely agree that we have to stop LNG supply, Russian LNG supply to Europe. I understand also that there is this International Energy Agency report which said that Europe will still need, I think, around 15 BCM to find from somewhere for the next year if there is a total ban on Russian oil and gas. But I also want to remind that there is a EU policy. I think it's stated in Repower EU that EU is going to stop Russian Russian gas. To stop buying Russian gas, even LNG, for the future. So I do hope that this strategy will be realized for the future. Russia will definitely try to find some other countries to sell its gas. But as we discussed in the first panel, neither China nor other countries will not be interested in so much amount of gas, which Europe actually bought before from Russia. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Elena. And then last answer to this goes to Ambassador Morningstar.
Yeah, I'll make 3 quick points. First, just going back to the first question, I really think that sanctions need to be developed on oil field services. I don't know exactly the Schlumberger situation, but in general, I think we have to really look closely at that. I'll just say briefly that I think that LNG, that there should be an embargo on LNG supplies from Russia to Europe and maybe to other places, friendly countries as well. The third point, and maybe the last point, is, I ran a company prior to coming into the government for the first time in 1993. And, I get frustrated by this issue of long-term contracts. The EU wants to avoid long-term contracts, that companies want them to have some degree of certainty as to, what price is going to be to justify investment and so forth, that, business people can come to compromises. There should be ways to reach agreements that can protect both, either with points in a contract that where price negotiations can be reopened, triggers with respect to price, any number of creative ways that business people can think of to resolve those situations. This is not an issue with Russia, by the way. It's an issue with Europeans dealing with, whether it's American companies, Qatar, other potential suppliers of LNG. And I think that work needs to be done in that area.
Okay, thank you. So we're absolutely out of time. I will just give everyone 15 seconds apiece for 1 to 2 sentences of closing thoughts for the future. What can we do to support Ukraine? What can we do on sanctions? Any just kind of top level comments. So we'll go Paul, Natalia, Elena, and then Ambassador Moore.
Yeah, I guess I feel like a broken record, but I just say there's a ton of things we could do. I mean, we know exactly what we need to do, and we know it would enable us to isolate Russia and achieve Ukrainian victory tomorrow. So we just have to decide that that's what we want and do it.
Okay, just do it. Paul, great. Natalia.
Yes, so the price cap should be reduced like in the upcoming months, and this year we should set a goal to end the war, to win the war by helping in all the directions we know to Ukraine. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalia. Elena?
Russia was threatening the world that they are a nuclear country and they can do whatever they want because they are a nuclear country for so long that I would propose to do not fear this Russian threats anymore and just move forward with everything what the Western countries can do to support Ukraine. Please do not afraid of any scenarios which Russia is talking about.
Okay, thank you, Elena. And Ambassador Morningstar, last word to you.
Yeah, just remember that energy sanctions are not zero sum, that we should take the steps that we've talked about, that we need to remember that both gas and the energy transition are critical to energy security, and recognize that we have to double down on both, including decarbonizing gas to reduce dependence on any one supplier, and to do what we can do to help Ukraine in the immediate term and then in the short to midterm with respect to their energy infrastructure.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it better myself. I just want to close out this panel by saying thank you, and thank you for everyone's expert comments, not only in this part of the event, but also the previous event. As a reminder, you're watching the Transatlantic Energy Landscape 1 year after Russia's invasion. This is part of Penn Energy Week. This is the marquee multidisciplinary science, technology, and policy conference that's held every year right here on the University of Pennsylvania's campus. This is an event that is sponsored today by the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, where I'm sitting right now. And I just want to thank also my co-host and co-organizer, Anna Mikulska, who moderated the first panel, and just really thank everyone for their time and interest. Obviously, we need to continue to support Ukraine, as all the panelists have said, to win as quickly as possible, and that means not only militarily, but in terms of supporting their energy security, resiliency, and pushing back on Russia via sanctions and other economic means as well. So with that, I want to close this panel. Thank everyone for their time and interest, and I encourage everyone who is in and around Philadelphia to come to all of the in-person Penn Energy Week events here on campus, and also keep an eye out online for all of the online events that are going on, not only today, but for the rest of this week. And as always, just keep thinking about the importance of energy security globally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.